and Lex Helmer was about to die.
The 2nd of May was a bad day. They were having heavy shelling that day. By this time, the German aeroplanes had pinpointed their positions pretty well, even though they were quite well concealed, and they were getting a lot of very accurate artillery fire. It appears that he was on his way to the guns. He received a direct hit from a shell, and as you know, as is evident from something like that, there was little left of him.
They had to collect bits of him because the shell was a big shell and it was a direct hit. So all that was left, you know, were small chunks of flesh. I think something like perhaps we see when car bombs have exploded directly underneath someone in the modern world. So what they did was McCrae supervised the picking up of the fragments of body, and they were packed into a burlap sack, which was shaped roughly into a human body shape, and that was what was buried. There wasn't really enough to have a corpse as we would think of a corpse.
Lieutenant Helmer was killed at the guns. He was a nice boy. His diary's last words were, "It has quieted a little, and I shall try to get a good sleep." His girl's picture had a hole right through it, and we buried it with him. I said the committal service over him as well as I could from memory. A soldier's death.
John McCrae got no sleep the night he buried Lex Helmer. A wooden cross had been placed on his grave in the field behind the hospital, which had gradually become a cemetery. McCrae could see the cross from where he sat on the step of an ambulance. He was seen by the other officers to be writing in his notebook, looking occasionally at the grave and at the poppies which had sprung up in the churned earth. John McCrae was writing in Flanders Fields.
Helmer's death acted as a catalyst. It stood for the loss of so many young lives. Here was this young man, 22 years of age. He just graduated from McGill University. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was popular, well-liked. John says when he buried him, he had his girlfriend's picture with him, which had a hole in it through it, so they buried that. So he'd had love in his life. He was full of promise. Life could have been so full of promise, and here it was, all gone in a moment. And I think for him, it spoke of not just Helmer, but there's so many thousands like him. And that, I think, was the catalyst that moved him to write the poem.
We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields.
John McCrae's poem would give the poppy a whole new identity. By the early 1920s, it had become the international symbol of remembrance, and so it has remained. But there are other icons that emerged from the Second Battle of Ypres. As soon as the war was over, Flanders was being invaded all over again, this time by broken-hearted families anxious to see where and how their sons and husbands had died. Farmhouses along battlefields would be converted to trench cafes, where visitors could buy small meals and drinks and the souvenirs of war. Flower pots and vases made from artillery shells, clocks decorated with rounds of ammunition. There used to be hundreds of these cafes. This is now the only one left in Flanders. It has been a family business since 1918. For a few francs, you can visit the trenches, left untouched since the end of the war. These are the trenches where we lost a generation.
Now available from the National Film Board of Canada. Order your own copy of this timeless tribute to Dr. John McCrae for only $19.95. Call 1-800-267-7710 now.
After 17 days, the Second Battle of Ypres was over, and there was little either side had to show for it. No major ground had been lost or gained, no great victory or defeat. It It was as if the whole thing had been for nothing. Yet, 100,000 soldiers had died. 2,000 Canadians had been killed in the first 6 days. John McCrae was alive, but the carnage had left its mark.
He was there for 17 days and nights, not taking his shoes off, not taking his clothes off, looking after the dreadfully wounded and so on. And that experience was just devastating to him. And after that, people said he changed. Some nurses one nurse who saw him in Paris around shortly afterwards said just didn't recognize him. He seemed to have aged about 20 years.
John McCrae was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and with some reluctance settled into a desk job at the new No. 3 General Hospital a few miles behind the lines in the town of Boulogne. The hospital was staffed by nurses and doctors from McGill University. Although they had the best possible training before they left Canada, Nurse Claire Gass, who would later copy his poem in her daily journal, noted that nothing could have prepared them for what they would experience here.
June 1st, 1915. Some of the new patients have dreadful, dreadful wounds. One young boy with his face shot away, both arms gone, and a great many wounds in both legs. Troops go through almost daily, and when we're able, we always wave strenuously at them. Poor lads, they seem so happy and full of life. There's a difference when they come back on the ambulance trains. Then they are silent. And so are we.
The October entry in Claire Gass's diary shows that John McCrae's poem was in circulation among the troops before it was officially published in Punch magazine on the 8th of December, 1915.
So many of the other heroic poems of the First World War predict an outcome, demand an outcome, almost insist that we must win, because if we don't win, it's been a waste of time. In Flanders Field never says that. It says if. And to that extent, it keeps you in suspense. That war is still being fought for those dead people. And there's an incredibly clever element to it, which I don't think has been commented on very often before, which is that by holding the whole issue, the whole resolution of the war, in suspension, he's actually freezing the mindset of the soldiers of whom he's writing. In other words, that poem is actually taking you inside the head of a soldier almost at the moment of death and leaving it open. And of course, to those people who died 1914 to 1918, they don't know who won the war. To that extent, it's remained an incredibly vibrant, incredibly alive poem.
The poem was recited and discussed in the trenches of Flanders and all along the Western Front. It was a tremendous success, but did little to change the ongoing reality, for the war simply trudged on from week to week and now from year to year. By the end of 1917, the war devolved into shift work. Soldiers would be moved to the front on rotation. If they survived, they would be brought out for a short time until it was their turn again. Mail would be delivered, bodies removed, meals served, guns fired. Death had become a way of life. Violence and misery and killing had become a day job. Although not everyone shared the same work ethic.
A lot of British soldiers, particularly British battalions, adopted a kind of live and let live view. When they went into the line, they wouldn't hurt the Germans didn't hurt them, and that's how it kind of worked. But there were those nasty people up the line, Canadians, Australians, Scots, who didn't seem to understand this sensible arrangement, and who would, the bastards, fight, cause trouble, shell, patrol, and make trouble on a piece of line that otherwise had been perfectly peaceful. So when the 32nd Cornwall Light Infantry go back, they find instead of the comfy relationship with the Saxons on the other side is all stirred up and starts bombing and stonking and patrolling them. This isn't fair. And they got to fight back. But the Canadians felt they couldn't go home until the war was over. And the sooner it was over, the better. And that, I think, is what simply explains why some of them were more aggressive than others. and why the Canadians perhaps were more aggressive than other battalions. And it's no discredit to the 32nd Cornwall Light Infantry, because on the whole, the British had lost far more men. They were more likely to be a battalion of men in their 30s and 40s than kids in their teens and 20s. And when you get to, as we both can testify, when you get to that age, your desire to kill or be killed diminishes substantially. You know, war should be fought by really old guys who the world could easily spare. But the trouble is they wouldn't fight.
The success of In Flanders Fields had made John McCrae famous. He could have returned to Canada and gone on the propaganda trail, raising money and the now flagging enthusiasm for the war. He could have transferred to a staff job in London and escaped the trenches completely. Instead, he stayed at the hospital. As the war made its way into the fall of 1917, it was noted that Colonel John McCrae had become more remote, moody. He had started taking his horse Bonfire and his dog Bonneau for long, lonely rides into the French countryside. They put it down to fatigue. Early in January 1918, he complained of feeling sleepy and tired. He was taken to No. 14 Hospital, where British officers were treated, in the little French coastal town of Wimereux. He told his fellow doctors that he thought he had developed pneumonia. They found no evidence of it, but kept him in for observation. He slipped into a coma, and at 1:30 in the morning of January 28, 1918, John McCrae, soldier, doctor, and poet, died. The postmortem revealed that he had pneumonia in both lungs. The next day, his funeral procession made its way through the narrow streets of the French town to the cemetery on the hill. It was one of the best attended funerals of the war.
It was certainly a mark of the esteem and the affection in which he was held. It was held the day after his death. It was a lovely spring afternoon. Because he died in No. 14 British Hospital for Officers at Wimereux, the nearest cemetery was Wimereux Communal Cemetery. It was actually a cemetery for the citizens of the town of Wimereux, but it also had an area, it was on a hillside, a lovely hillside overlooking the sea, overlooking the English Channel. They had the nurses from No. 3. This was quite an unusual thing, but they got permission for them to attend, and they wore their caps and cloaks. His coffin was draped with the Union Jack because he died in a British hospital and not in a Canadian hospital. They had a guard of honor, and they had a contingent of the men from the hospital and from No. 14. They had Bonfire, John McCrae's horse, with the traditional white ribbon, which they wore for funerals, with his boots reversed in the stirrups. And it was a very, very moving funeral. Because he died so suddenly, there was great sadness, great grief. It was obviously a very, very sad affair.
He was buried in the section of the cemetery the British reserved for their officers. His famous poem would be carved in stone near his grave. And later, in his honor, the town of Wimereux would name a street after him and misspell McCrae. His personal effects and his medals were sent home to his mother in Guelph. And it was these medals, some 80 years later, which would once again revive the memory of the man who wrote In Flanders Fields.
Now available from the National Film Board of Canada. Order your own copy of this timeless tribute to Dr. John McCrae for only $19.95. Call 1-800-267-7710 now.